What if I told you that the single most powerful thing you could do for your long-term health, your metabolic function, your cardiovascular fitness, and even your cognitive longevity isn't some cutting-edge drug, it isn't some exotic supplement stack, and it isn't the brutal high-intensity interval protocol that leaves you gasping on the floor? What if I told you it's something so unsexy, so deceptively simple that most people either completely ignore it or get it completely wrong? We're talking about Zone 2 training. And I know, some of you have heard me talk about this before. But here's the thing. The more time I spend with Iñigo San-Millán, and the more I dig into the physiology behind what's actually happening inside your cells when you train in this zone, the more convinced I become that we have only scratched the surface of what this type of training can do. So today we are going back in deep. And I promise you, by the end of this conversation, you're going to look at a slow, steady bike ride or jog in a completely different way. Let me set the stage for you. Iñigo San-Millán is one of the world's foremost experts on metabolism, exercise physiology, and mitochondrial function. He works with professional cyclists at the Tour de France level. He has spent decades studying what separates elite athletes from everyone else at the cellular level, not just in terms of performance, but in terms of metabolic health. And what he has found consistently, rigorously, across elite athletes and metabolically diseased patients alike, is that the answer almost always comes back to mitochondria and to lactate and to the training zone that most recreational exercisers either skip entirely or pass through too quickly to benefit from. Zone 2. So let's start with the basics, because I think one of the biggest problems with the way Zone 2 gets discussed in the fitness world is that people hear the term and they think they know what it means. They've seen heart rate zones on their Apple Watch or their Garmin, and they assume that Zone 2 on their wearable device is the same Zone 2 that Iñigo is talking about. It's not. And this distinction matters enormously. When Iñigo talks about Zone 2, he is talking about a very specific metabolic state, a specific threshold of effort defined not by a heart rate number on a screen, but by what is happening inside your mitochondria, your muscle fibers, and your blood. Specifically, he defines Zone 2 as the highest intensity of exercise at which you can clear lactate as fast as you are producing it. That's the key phrase. The highest intensity at which lactate production and lactate clearance are still in balance. Now I want to spend some time on lactate here because I think it's one of the most misunderstood molecules in all of exercise physiology. For decades, and I mean decades, lactate was treated as the villain. It was the thing that made your muscles burn, the thing that caused fatigue, the metabolic waste product that your body was desperately trying to get rid of. Lactic acid buildup became this catch-all explanation for why you felt terrible at the end of a hard race or a tough workout, and almost all of that was wrong, or at least profoundly incomplete. Lactate is not a waste product. Lactate is a fuel. It is a signaling molecule. It is something that your body produces deliberately and uses deliberately. And understanding what lactate actually does changes everything about how you think about exercise and metabolism. Here's what's actually happening. When you exercise, your muscles need energy. That energy comes primarily from glucose and fat, which are broken down through a series of metabolic pathways inside your cells. The main stage for this process is the mitochondria, these remarkable organelles inside your cells that act as the energy factories. Now, when you're exercising at a low intensity, your mitochondria are doing most of the heavy lifting. They're taking glucose and fat and running them through a beautifully efficient process called oxidative phosphorylation, producing ATP, the currency of energy in your body, and producing very little waste. This is aerobic metabolism at its finest. But as you push harder, as intensity increases, your muscles need more energy faster than your mitochondria can deliver it aerobically. So your cells start relying more heavily on a faster but less efficient pathway called the glycolysis, which breaks down glucose very quickly but produces lactate as a byproduct. Now here's where it gets interesting. That lactate doesn't just sit there causing problems. It gets shuttled, actively transported into adjacent muscle fibers, into the heart, into the liver, into the brain, where it can be taken up and used as a direct fuel source. The heart, in fact, loves lactate. It's one of the heart's preferred fuels during exercise. So lactate is being produced in some cells and consumed in others simultaneously. It is a dynamic, living, metabolic currency being passed back and forth across your entire body. The reason zone 2 is so special is because at that specific intensity, that highest intensity where production and clearance are balanced, you are maximally stressing the mitochondria in a very particular way. You are pushing them hard enough that they adapt. They get more efficient, they grow in number, they get better at using fat as a fuel, they get better at clearing lactate, but you are not pushing so hard that you overwhelm the system. You're threading a needle. You're getting the maximum training stimulus for mitochondrial adaptation without tipping into the kind of metabolic stress that requires extensive recovery and that actually starts to compromise rather than improve mitochondrial function. And this is where the connection to metabolic disease becomes so striking to me. One of the things that Iñigo has observed across years of research is that individuals with metabolic dysfunction, people with type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, obesity, metabolic syndrome, almost universally show severely impaired mitochondrial function. Their mitochondria are not just fewer in number, they are less efficient. They are worse at using fat as a fuel. They are worse at clearing lactate, and the lactate clearance piece is particularly telling because it means that in these individuals, lactate accumulates at much lower exercise intensities than it does in healthy people or in trained athletes. They're zone 2. The intensity at which lactate is still in balance is very, very low. Sometimes it's just walking. Sometimes it's even less than that. Now think about what that means for a moment. If your mitochondria are so impaired that your lactate starts accumulating the moment you pick up the pace to even a light jog, then any exercise above a very gentle walk is immediately pushing you out of zone 2 and into a state of metabolic stress. You're spending most of your exercise time in a zone where you're producing lactate faster than you can clear it, where you're relying more heavily on glycolysis rather than fat oxidation, and where the training adaptation you most need, improved mitochondrial function, is actually not being optimally stimulated. It's a cruel irony. The people who most need zone 2 training are often the ones who have the hardest time actually being in zone 2 because their metabolic machinery is so compromised that zone 2 for them is barely above rest. This is one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this topic, because the conventional advice for people who are metabolically unwell, go exercise, get your heart rate up, do some cardio, is not wrong exactly, but it's missing a critical piece. It's not just about moving. It's about moving in the right zone, at the right intensity, in a way that's actually training the specific metabolic machinery that needs to be fixed. So how do you know if you're in zone 2? This is the practical question that I know a lot of you are going to ask. And the honest answer is that the gold standard is a laboratory test, a lactate threshold test where you exercise at progressively increasing intensities and take blood samples to measure your blood lactate level at each stage. You're looking for the intensity at which your lactate is around 1 to 2 millimoles per liter. Roughly speaking, the highest intensity at which it's still in that steady state balance. But obviously, most people don't have access to a lactate meter and a metabolic cart. So what's the practical proxy? The one that I go, and I keep coming back to, the one that I think is the most reliable without lab equipment, is the talk test. Zone 2 is the highest intensity at which you could hold a conversation, not a monosyllabic conversation, not just grunting yes or no, but a real, somewhat comfortable conversation while still feeling like you're working. You could speak in complete sentences. You'd be breathing harder than normal. You'd be aware that you're exercising, but you could talk. The moment it becomes genuinely difficult to string sentences together, the moment you're gasping between words, you've probably crossed out of zone 2 and into zone 3. It's a surprisingly reliable proxy, and it's free. Heart rate can also be used, but with some important caveats. The problem with heart rate-based zone 2 is that the zones on consumer devices are almost always calculated using formulas that are population averages. They don't account for your individual physiology, your fitness level, your age, specific variability, or your actual lactate threshold. The commonly cited formula is 180 minus your age for the upper limit of zone 2, which comes from Dr. Philip Maffetone's work. And for some people, that's a pretty reasonable ballpark. But for others, it's significantly off. A 45-year-old recreational runner using that formula would cap zone 2 at 135 beats per minute. For some people, that's right. For others who are very fit, their zone 2 might go up to 155 or 160. And for a sedentary, metabolically compromised person, their zone 2 might actually be at 120 beats per minute or lower. There's just too much individual variability for a formula to capture. This brings me to something that I think is really important to understand about zone 2, which is that it changes. It's not a fixed number. As you train consistently in zone 2, your mitochondria adapt. Your lactate clearance improves. Your fat oxidation improves. And your zone 2 ceiling rises. What was once right at your zone 2 limit becomes comfortable, sustainable, and you have to push a little harder to stay at the same metabolic threshold. This is the definition of fitness improvement at the cellular level. And it happens remarkably fast if you're consistent. We're talking weeks to months of dedicated zone 2 work before you start seeing meaningful shifts in where your zone 2 sits. Iñigo has data on professional cyclists that illustrates this beautifully. These elite athletes can sustain power outputs during a zone 2 ride that would absolutely devastate an average person, putting out 300, 350, even 400 watts in some cases, while maintaining a completely stable lactate level in that 1 to 2 millimole range. Their mitochondria are so extraordinarily efficient that they can sustain an effort most people could only maintain for a few minutes before lactate starts rocketing upward. And the training age required to get there, we're talking years, sometimes a decade or more, of consistent zone 2 work. It is the foundation of elite endurance performance. Not the interval sessions, not the VO2 max work. Those matter too, but they sit on top of a massive base of zone 2 training that has built the underlying mitochondrial machinery. Now I want to address something that I hear constantly, and that I think is one of the biggest reasons people don't do enough zone 2. They think it's too easy. They think it's not doing anything. They're used to measuring the quality of a workout by how destroyed they feel afterward. If they're not sweating through their shirt, if they're not sore the next day, if their heart rate isn't spiking, it doesn't count. It didn't work. And zone 2, done correctly, often doesn't feel like that. You finish a 60-minute zone 2 ride and you feel fine. A little tired, a little sweaty, but not wrecked. And for a lot of people, that's incredibly unsatisfying. We have this deeply ingrained, no pain, no gain mentality that actually works against us when it comes to the training that would do us the most long-term good. I've even struggled with this personally. I'll be on the bike, I'm in zone 2. I feel like I should be working harder, and there's this voice in my head telling me to push more, do more, go faster. And I have to actively resist that impulse because I know, intellectually, rationally, that going harder would be counterproductive. It would shift me out of zone 2. It would push me into a state where I'm relying more on glycolysis and less on fat oxidation, and I would actually be getting less of the specific adaptation I'm trying to drive. More effort, paradoxically, would produce less of the result I want. This is one of the things I respect most about Iñigo's work. He has the data to push back against the intuition that harder is always better. He has seen it in the lab, in the field, with elite athletes and sick patients alike, that the slow, boring, conversational pace work is where the metabolic magic happens. And once you understand the physiology, once you understand why it works, why mitochondria respond to this specific stimulus, why fat oxidation is optimized in this zone, why lactate clearance improves with this training, it stops feeling like you're being cheated out of a hard workout and starts feeling like you're doing something genuinely sophisticated and intelligent for your body. Let's talk about duration and frequency, because I think this is where people also get stuck. How much zone 2 training do you actually need to see meaningful adaptations? Iñigo's answer, and one that I broadly agree with, is that you need at least 3 hours per week at minimum, and ideally more like 4 to 5 hours to drive meaningful mitochondrial adaptations in a consistent and progressive way. And those hours need to be in relatively long, continuous bouts, not 3 20-minute sessions. Ideally, you want sessions of 45 minutes at minimum, and 1 hour plus sessions are even better. The reason is that mitochondrial adaptation takes time to kick in during a session. The signaling pathways that tell your mitochondria to adapt, things like AMPK activation, PGC1 alpha upregulation, these start ramping up the longer you're in the zone. A 20-minute session might not be getting you into the full adaptive window the way a 60 or 90-minute session does. For most people with busy lives, I recommend trying to get 3 to 4 zone 2 sessions per week of 45 to 60 minutes each. If you can get one longer session on a weekend of 90 minutes or 2 hours, even better. The modality doesn't matter all that much. Cycling, running, rowing, swimming, walking uphill, as long as you can sustain the intensity and stay in zone 2. Cycling tends to be my personal preference and Iñigo's preference for most people because it's low impact. You can sustain it for a long time without the joint stress that running accumulates, and it's relatively easy to monitor power output if you want an objective intensity measure. Power output, by the way, is something I want to mention briefly because if you do have access to a power meter, either on a stationary bike or on a road bike, it is the most objective measure of zone 2 intensity you can get outside of a laboratory. Power doesn't drift the way heart rate does. Heart rate responds to all kinds of things: heat, humidity, caffeine, how much you slept, whether you're stressed. and it can be a somewhat noisy signal. Power output is just power output. If you know your zone 2 power from a lactate test, say it's 200 watts for you, you just ride at 200 watts and you know you're in the zone, regardless of what your heart rate is doing on a given day. Now, I want to get into something that I find particularly fascinating, which is the relationship between zone 2 training and fat oxidation, because this is where the metabolic health implications become really profound, and where I think the conversation needs to go beyond just athletic performance and into the territory of longevity and disease prevention. One of the hallmarks of good metabolic health is what we call metabolic flexibility, the ability of your cells to switch efficiently between using glucose and fat as fuel, depending on what's available and what's needed. Metabolically healthy, well-trained individuals have extraordinary metabolic flexibility. They can be burning predominantly fat at moderate exercise intensities. They can shift seamlessly to burning more glucose when intensity demands it, and they can shift back. Metabolically compromised individuals, those with insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, have lost much of this flexibility. They are much more reliant on glucose at all times. Their fat oxidation is blunted, and their mitochondria, which are the organelles responsible for burning fat, are impaired in both number and function. What Iñigo has shown, and what others are now confirming, is that zone 2 training is one of the most powerful interventions we have for restoring metabolic flexibility. It does this by directly training the mitochondria to get better at fat oxidation. When you spend time in zone 2, you are in a metabolic state where fat oxidation is near its maximum. You are forcing your mitochondria to use fat as fuel, and like any other biological system that responds to stress with adaptation, they get better at it. They become more efficient. They increase in number, a process called mitochondrial biogenesis. They develop more of the enzymes and transporters needed to move fat into the mitochondria and burn it efficiently. And over time, your fat oxidation at any given submaximal intensity increases measurably. This has implications that go well beyond cycling performance. If your mitochondria are better at burning fat, you are less reliant on glucose. You have better blood sugar control. You have better insulin sensitivity. You're less likely to experience the glucose swings that drive hunger, cravings, and energy crashes. You're building the metabolic machinery that underlies not just fitness, but genuine long-term health and disease resistance. Type 2 diabetes at its core is a disease of mitochondrial dysfunction and metabolic inflexibility, and zone 2 training is essentially physical therapy for your mitochondria. It is directly targeting the broken machinery. I think about this sometimes when I'm talking with patients. We have extraordinary pharmacological tools for managing blood sugar, metformin GLP-1 agonists, SGLT2 inhibitors, and I use them when they're appropriate. But none of those drugs restore mitochondrial function the way exercise does. None of them actually fix the underlying biology. Exercise, and specifically the right kind of exercise in the right zone, is the closest thing we have to a mitochondrial repair protocol. And the evidence for it just keeps getting stronger. Let me bring up another piece of the conversation that I had with Iñigo that I found really illuminating, which is the question of high-intensity training and how it fits into this picture. Because I want to be clear, I'm not saying you should only do Zone 2. Zone 2 is the foundation, but it's not the complete picture. High-intensity interval training has its own distinct benefits. It trains different adaptations, central cardiovascular adaptations, VO2 max improvements, the ability to buffer and clear hydrogen ions at very high intensities, These matter too, especially for longevity. VO2 max, as I've discussed at length before, is one of the single strongest predictors of all cause mortality we have. And to maximize VO2 max, you need to spend some time at very high intensities, zone 5 essentially. The framework that Iñigo and I have converged on, and that the scientific literature increasingly supports, is something called polarized training. The idea is that your training distribution should be heavily weighted toward zone 2, somewhere around 80% of your total training volume, with a smaller but meaningful amount of very high intensity work, roughly 20%, and almost nothing in the middle zones. Zone 3 and Zone 4, the moderate to hard intensity ranges, are sort of the no man's land of training. They're hard enough to generate significant fatigue and require meaningful recovery, but they're not producing the specific mitochondrial adaptations of Zone 2, and they're not producing the VO2 max adaptations of Zone 5. A lot of recreational athletes spend most of their time here, what I sometimes call the gray zone, going moderately hard on most of their runs or rides, feeling like they're working, accumulating fatigue, but not really optimally driving either set of adaptations. They'd be better served by going easier on their easy days and harder on their hard days. This is counterintuitive for a lot of people. Going easier on easy days, really easy, genuinely in Zone 2, feels like a step backward. But the data from elite endurance sports, from physiology labs, and from training theory consistently support the polarized approach. The athletes who perform best at the highest levels, the Tour de France cyclists, the elite marathon runners, the Olympic rowers, train the vast majority of their volume at low intensities and do a small amount of very high intensity work. The moderate intensity training that most recreational athletes love is not where the elite athletes spend their time, and increasingly the evidence suggests it's not optimal for health and performance at any level. Let me shift gears a little and talk about some of the practical and psychological aspects of implementing Zone 2, because I think the information is only useful if people can actually act on it. One of the most common questions I get is whether outdoor running or cycling works for Zone 2, and the answer is yes, with some caveats. The challenge with outdoor exercise is that pace and intensity naturally vary with terrain, wind, and other factors. If you're running on a flat path in mild weather, it's pretty easy to maintain a consistent Zone 2 effort. The moment you hit a hill, you're probably pushing into Zone 3 or higher. So you need to either modify your route to stay relatively flat, or, and this is what I recommend, learn to slow down dramatically on hills to keep your breathing and effort level consistent. Most people find this almost offensively slow. Walking up hills while everyone else runs past you is a pride challenge, but it's metabolically correct. Indoor cycling, whether on a smart trainer with a power meter or on a stationary bike at the gym, gives you the most control. You can set a target power output or resistance, maintain it consistently for an hour, and know with reasonable confidence that you're where you want to be. I do most of my Zone 2 work on a bike with a power meter. It removes the ambiguity, and I listen to podcasts or audiobooks, which makes the time pass much more easily than staring at a wall. One thing I want to address is boredom. Zone 2 training is, by design, not exciting. You're not pushing hard. You're not trying to beat a time or a record. You're just sustaining for an hour. And some people find this almost unbearable. I get it. I really do. I have a personality that tends toward intensity, and sitting in Zone 2 for 90 minutes while listening to a podcast requires a certain mental reframe. The reframe that works for me is thinking about what's actually happening at cellular level during that ride. I'm literally remodeling my mitochondria. I'm building metabolic infrastructure that will make me healthier, more resilient, and more capable for decades to come. When I think about Zone 2 that way, not as a workout, but as a long-term investment in the biological machinery that keeps me alive and functional, it becomes much easier to stay in the zone, literally and figuratively. I also want to talk about Zone 2 in the context of aging, because this is where I think it becomes almost urgent. Mitochondrial dysfunction is one of the hallmarks of aging. As we get older, we lose mitochondria, the ones we have become less efficient. Our ability to produce ATP declines. Our metabolic flexibility decreases. Our fat oxidation drops. And this decline in mitochondrial function is deeply interconnected with so many of the health problems we associate with aging: muscle loss, cognitive decline, insulin resistance, cardiovascular disease, reduced exercise capacity. The mitochondria are not just energy factories. They are orchestrators of cellular health, of apoptosis, of oxidative stress management, of a whole cascade of biological processes that matter profoundly for longevity. What Zone 2 training does, mechanistically, is slow and in some cases reverse this mitochondrial decline. It stimulates mitochondrial biogenesis, the creation of new mitochondria. It improves the efficiency of existing mitochondria. It enhances the cell's ability to recycle and repair damaged mitochondrial components through a process called mitophagy. These are powerful biological effects, and the time window during which they're most impactful is long. The research suggests that older adults show robust mitochondrial adaptations to Zone 2 training even into their 70s and 80s. It is never too late to start, and it is always worth doing. I think about some of my older patients, people in their 60s and 70s who have spent their lives largely sedentary, who are metabolically compromised, who are struggling with blood sugar, with energy, with body composition. And I think about what Zone 2 training, started consistently and maintained for 6 months, a year, 2 years, could do for their biology. Not as a replacement for other interventions, but as a cornerstone, as the thing that's fixing the fundamental machinery that everything else depends on. The evidence is compelling enough that I now consider Zone 2 training essentially non-negotiable for my patients as a core component of their long-term health strategy. Let me close with something that I think ties all of this together: the concept of what Iñigo calls the metabolic signature of health. When he looks at the data from his lab, the lactate curves, the fat oxidation rates, the mitochondrial enzyme activities, the power output at Zone 2, he sees a clear picture of what metabolic health looks like from the inside out. And that picture is defined by efficient mitochondria, robust fat oxidation, excellent lactate clearance capacity, and the ability to sustain significant exercise at low intensities without accumulating metabolic stress. These are the biomarkers of someone whose cellular machinery is functioning well, and they are trainable. They respond to the stimulus of consistent Zone 2 work in a way that almost no drug or supplement can replicate. I think that's ultimately why this conversation keeps pulling me back in. We have this extraordinary lever, this specific type of training, this specific metabolic zone that is simultaneously the foundation of elite athletic performance and the most powerful tool we have for metabolic disease prevention and treatment. It connects the professional cyclist grinding out miles in the Alps and the newly diagnosed diabetic trying to reclaim their health. They're both in Zone 2. They're both doing the same fundamental biological work. They're just doing it at wildly different intensities, because their mitochondrial machinery is at wildly different levels. And both of them can improve, both of them can build. If you take one thing from this video, I want it to be this: Zone 2 is not the easy option. It is not the lazy workout. It is the foundational work. It is the thing that builds the machinery that makes everything else possible. Your performance, your metabolic health, your cardiovascular resilience, your longevity. And it requires the discipline to go slower than you want to go, more consistently than you might feel motivated to go, for longer than feels immediately satisfying. But the biology doesn't lie. The mitochondria respond, the lactate curves shift, the fat oxidation improves, the metabolic health markers move in the right direction. And over months and years, the cumulative effect of that work compounds into something genuinely remarkable. So get on the bike. Lace up the shoes, find your zone 2, protect it, stay in it, and be patient with the process. Your mitochondria are counting on you.